So, hello, Dr. Shiva. Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you in this program. And let me just start asking you how you are today and how is the evening in India?
It's been a busy day, but everything's good.
Everything is good. Okay. Let me just, for those, I'm sure that a lot of the audience know who you are, but let me just introduce you from, I'm going to use one of the books you wrote, Oneness versus the 1%. I'm going to use it for the introduction. So Vandana Shiva is a world-renowned environmental thinker, an activist, a leader in the International Forum on Globalization, and of the Slow Food Movement, director of Navdanya and of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology and Ecology, and a tireless crusader for farmers, peasants, and women's rights. She is the author and editor of a score of influential books. She is a recipient of over 20 international awards. And also let me add that which is very interesting for what you do. You received your PhD in, I think, philosophy of physics, right? The quantum theory.
The foundations of quantum theory, yeah.
Yeah. Do you still use that in your activities in your life, quantum theory activist?
Yes. It's what my orientation is. It is my worldview. Of course, I don't on an everyday practice that discipline. But it is what has shaped my thinking.
Yeah. I'm going to start with a sort of a personal note. Two of your books analyzing the negative impacts of the Green Revolution, I think was the monoculture of the mind and the violence of the Green Revolution, became for me some of the key sources when writing my bachelor's thesis at the University of California in the 1990s, a long, long time ago. And the logic of the Green Revolution, creating improved seeds that are good only for one season while needing chemical fertilizers and pesticides to grow them, seems foundationally flawed and short-sighted. I don't know, it just makes no sense from the point of a small or even a medium-sized farmer caring for the land, especially in the developing countries, for whom subsistence farming was often the main means of sustenance in the 60s or 70s when the Green Revolution was first introduced, for example, in Mexico and in your home country in India. In your opinion, what was then the underlying agenda of the Green Revolution? I mean, it was supposed to eliminate poverty, but often it created one.
Yes. Poverty and removing hunger was not on the agenda of the Green Revolution. Because I've done this book on the violence that emerged in Punjab in the late 70s and early 80s, short decade after the Green Revolution was imposed on Punjab. And I had done my MSc Honours in particle physics there. So I knew that land, and I knew it was prosperous, I knew it was peaceful. And what turned it into a discontented region to the extent that farmers rose in revolt in 1984. And the military had to be sent to the Golden Temple. And that's why I wrote this book for the United Nations University. And I realized that actually the real agenda of the Green Revolution was to continue using the chemicals and the factories and the technologies that had emerged and originated in Hitler's Germany. IG Farben had partnerships with Standard Oil and Rockefeller. Standard Oil provide the fossil fuels, and Rockefeller was the financial baron also. One created the banks. The technological expertise of chemistry was with IG Farben. But without fossil fuels, these chemicals couldn't have been made. The two most important chemicals for the Green Revolution are synthetic fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers based on fossil fuels. Basically, they burn fossil fuels at high temperature to fix atmospheric nitrogen. There, of course, are other ways for fixing atmospheric nitrogen. Pulses, legumes are nitrogen-fixing crops. They are nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. And our research in Navdanya, the movement I started, has shown that actually organic soils have built up for over 20 years in our valley 100% more nitrogen, whereas the soils on which nitrogen fertilizers applied have lost nitrogen up to 22%. So selling the chemical fertilizers and keeping a market going after the wars for chemicals in fertilizer, but also in pesticides. Even pesticides need fossil fuels. And the chemicals used for killing people in concentration camps, the technology is the same for making pesticides. The poison gases are the ancestors. So it isn't a surprise that in 1984, the year of the Punjab violence, there was also a horrible tragedy in the city of Bhopal, where a pesticide plant leaked and killed thousands of people. Now, nothing could make it clearer that pesticides kill human beings, insects, pests, but even though the original intention was killing human beings, they were retooled to be exterminating insects. And insects which we need the bees and butterflies. They were turned into our enemies, so we have an insecticodon. Later, in the Vietnam War, you started to get herbicides. Agent Orange was sprayed on the forests of Vietnam in order to try and defeat the Viet Cong. The results of Agent Orange is still making the veterans suffer in America, and the people in Vietnam are still, children are still being born with birth defects. So the first drive was how to continue a market for war chemicals. Second was, how do you change the plant in order to accept this? Because Rockefeller had been trying to introduce chemicals to Indian agriculture from 1952. But every time they applied fertilizer, because our plants are bred for multiple purpose. We don't just grow crops for humans to eat. We grow crops for our animals. The straw feeds the animals. The straw goes back to the soil to feed the soil organisms. So our crops multiply the biomass and are tall varieties. But when you apply synthetic fertilizer, the tall varieties have a tendency of lodging. Now, this was the issue for which Norman Borlaug was brought in. He had worked in DuPont Defense Labs, and he worked with stool and wheat material from Japan, a Norin variety, to make the plants dwarfs, so that now you could pump them with fertilizer. And as he constantly said, I want every parliamentarian in India to scream and shout, give me fertilizers, give me more fertilizers. Now, exactly what today Mr. Gates is saying, I love fertilizers, give me more fertilizers. So the agenda was continuing the market of war chemicals. Therefore, plants had to be changed to adapt to the chemicals. And there was another agenda, which is why it was called the Green Revolution, because at that time, an angry peasantry in China was rising, and there was a Red Revolution. And the Americans thought that by commercializing and commodifying agriculture, the peasants of India would get trapped in a commercial treadmill and therefore would not turn to revolt. And the color green was not about ecology. The color green was just different from red. So that, along with the foreign policy objectives articulated so clearly by Kissinger. Kissinger said, food is a weapon.
Right.
When you sell arms, you control the governments. But when you create dependency on food, you control the people. And I often say, when you control seed, you control life on earth. So, the three things combined. There were factories that should have shut. They wanted them to continue. They wanted to create a market. Green Revolution was the system. Second, they now realized they could start controlling seed. And changing the seed became their beginning in trying to control the germplasm and genetic resources of the world. And third was food as a weapon.
It's very interesting that there seem to be so many kind of hidden agendas that are being exposed. But not really in the mainstream. You really have to kind of dig deep. Yet it's available in like books by different professors. Just to kind of support what you said, I just finished a very interesting book by Anthony Sutton, who is a U.S. professor, and he wrote a book about the Wall Street trilogy, where he writes, he did very deep investigation into how the Western bankers and industrialists, Rockefeller, DuPont, and others, how they supported the Nazi Germany and even the Bolshevik Revolution, early 20th century. So, and then of course the Operation Paperclip, right, where the Nazi scientists got to the United States, probably working on the Green Revolution seeds, right?
Actually,
as well.
They took it further. They took it to the second Green Revolution.
Right,
through genetic, and through the genetic.
Right, and it's exactly.
And the idea, the very false idea, that the gene is a master molecule. Everything is in the gene, even though the real biology tells us that living systems are complex organisms, and genes and the other proteins and RNA all work in concert. And the DNA is actually a dead molecule. It needs instructions from the other living system of which it is a part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talk of the genetically modified crops, right, as the second gene revolution. You often say that it's the second green revolution plus global patents. What do you mean by that? And would you say that the GMO exacerbated the problem by the green revolution?
Well, when I did the Green Revolution book, I realized that the chemical agriculture requires monocultures. Mm-hmm. And that's why 75% diversity was displaced immediately. Mm-hmm. And instead of 10,000 crops that we used to eat, we started growing and trading in 4 dominant crops. But the other was, biology is about maximizing the photosynthetic potential of life on Earth. When the sun shines and through photosynthesis you produce biomass, you produce carbohydrates. That's what creates more abundant needs for human beings and other beings. So the Green Revolution, as I described, had shrunk the capacity and reduced the potential. It shrunk the genetic base. So I was invited because of my book to a conference on new biotechnologies. It was called Laws of Life. It was organized in Geneva and a small place outside Geneva called Bourget. And at this meeting, the chemical industry was present, as was the United Nations, as was independent scientists like me. And the industry laid out very clearly that they needed genetic engineering in order to take patents. For them, the objective was of taking patents so that they could collect royalties. Mm-hmm. And royalties, landlords collected royalties from the land from peasants. Similarly, life lords want to collect royalties from every farmer. And they said at this meeting, first, that genetic engineering was their route to get patents. Second, they could not stop to look at the safety and the impact because they would lose the race. And they said there'll be 5 of us controlling food and health by the turn of the century.
Which happened.
But 60% of the seed is in the hands of the group I call the poison cartel. The same companies that were IG Farben and their partners in the States. Right. Monsanto and Bayer used to be Mobe. Now Monsanto has been bought by Bayer. Dow, DuPont used to work with these IG Farben companies, and definitely Standard Oil used to work with them. So they said, we'll be controlling seed, and we have to become bigger. And they also said clearly that, and it's not enough, that we can prevent the farmers of Europe from saving seeds. Mm-hmm. Most of the farmers of the world are in the South, and therefore we need an international treaty that will make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. Mm-hmm. And I said, but saving seeds is the highest duty on earth, in every culture, in every civilization. And the farmer's freedom to save and exchange seed is the highest form of freedom. And but you don't invent the seed, yeah? You're just saying, we'll take a patent, but patent is granted for an invention. And you don't invent the seed, you add a gene. Adding a gene is and claiming the seed is like bringing a brick into a building and saying, I made the building, I'm the architect, I'm the landlord. Now everyone else whose home it is should now pay me rent. So that's exactly when I decided I would save seeds. I would start. Eventually, the seed-saving movement became the movement of Dania. But I also decided to work with my government and our parliament. And we wrote laws that animals, plants, and seeds are not human inventions and therefore cannot be patented. Even today, the Americans are trying to knock that clause out. Yeah? Because America rests on only one thing, intellectual property. They're producing nothing. They've outsourced all production. It's only intellectual property through which they're controlling wealth. But intellectual property on creation itself is not just a theft from farmers, it becomes a theft from nature. And for me, it violates every ethical, ecological, intellectual principle. And that's why I've dedicated my life to challenging this. So not only is genetic engineering the second green revolution, it is taking the green revolution much further, because the same companies that brought us the green revolution are now using genetic engineering not just to control the seed and collect rents from farmers, but worse, to sell their chemicals even more. So the Roundup-ready crops sell more Roundup. The Bt toxin crops, which are supposed to control pests, they do not control pests. More pesticides are used.
Right. Exactly. And, it's very scary where it's going in the near future, talking about genetic engineering of humans, right? When you are talking about CRISPR. So maybe there'll be time, if we don't fight, that there won't be only having patents on seeds and animals, but maybe in the future, on humans, right, in the future. So,
but actually, not just in the future. The reason we could write the kind of laws we wrote in India is because any time I saw intellectual property being abused, I would bring the victims to India to address our parliament, meet our government. And two cases are very important. One was a case of Percy Smyser, whose canola crop was polluted, genetically polluted by Monsanto. And then Monsanto said, the genes in your crop that came from pollution are our property, and therefore you must pay $200,000. This case went all the way to Supreme Court, and even our foundation intervened in it. Eventually, the fine was removed, but the judges said, if you allow patenting of genes, this is the absurdity you will reach to. Because if a gene is patented, even though the plants are not, wherever the gene is, including in the plant, becomes the property of the polluter. Second was a cancer patient in California, John Moore, had cancer of the spleen. His doctor found that the protein in his blood was very interesting, and he patented it. His name was Dr. Gold, interestingly. And then he sold that patent to Ciba-Geigy, which is, which then became merged with Sandoz, AstraZeneca, and is now Syngenta. As a chemical industry, they are Novartis. So when I found out about this case, I brought John Moore to India, and he addressed our people, and he said, I am John Moore, patent number so-and-so. I am owned by Ciba-Geigy. So this urge to own humanity and manipulate humanity is actually the first step. Because another very important element, I've written about it in my book, Biopiracy. I've written about it also in the book, Oneness versus 1%. That, when the Nazi scientists were taken to America through paperclip, they carried with them the eugenics. And because there'd been an uproar against discrimination, biological discrimination against women, against colored people, against Jews. The Rockefeller Foundation decided they were now going to look for genetic determinists, atoms of determinism, they called it.
Right.
So it's below the skin. And no one can say that this is not right, because now it will be totally within your very body. And that's the roots of molecular biology. Right. Every scientist who got the Nobel Prize, the funding had come from Rockefeller. And that's how biology in all its different streams started to get strangled. And biology was reduced to molecular biology and genetic engineering. And so you look at young people, this is all the only discipline they're taught. They're not taught about complex organisms. They're not taught about evolution. They're not taught about biodiversity. So the Nazi link through chemicals is clear, but the Nazi link to biological determinism and the control over human beings and discrimination against human beings is clear. At that time, there were no Southerners. Of course, the Africans had been captured as slaves. But what the Americans were afraid of were the migrants from Greece and Italy. And so they created a term called social psychology, basically to control the migrants, to manipulate the mind. And in addition to banking, chemicals, Big Pharma, Rockefeller, and the billionaires of that time, the robber barons of the time, were also responsible for creating an education system that makes all this very natural and becomes the dominant idea of its time.
Yeah, it seems like it's touching every facet of our life, right? And just the other day, I listened to Professor Harari, the Israeli professor. He's talking about surveillance under your skin, kind of what you're saying. And Carl Schwab talks about, from the World Economic Forum, he talks about connecting the biological, physical, and the digital, right? The molecular synthetic biology. And so, we are in the process of the so-called Great Reset, right? The fourth industrial revolution, as the World Economic Forum describes it. A kind of a global top-down transformation of what we eat, right? Lab-grown food, how we move, electrical cars, how we pay, the digital currency, where we live, smart cities, even who we are made of, right? Artificial intelligence and transhumanism. What do you think of this global transformation? It seems like it's a kind of a natural evolution from the Green Revolution and GMOs, right? The Great Reset seems like right in the pattern of the history.
So if you think of it, the first industrial revolution was fossil fuels and industrialism, and that's given us climate change. The second was chemicals, and that gave the Green Revolution. It gave the toxics. It gave extinction. And third is engineering life itself, the second Green Revolution. The life sciences, they call it. Manipulating life and using it to take patterns. And you are right that within that control paradigm, the next logical step is the fourth industrial revolution. The convergence of biotechnology, chemicals, information technology. Now, the word artificial intelligence is very, very artificial, because intelligence is first and foremost very complex. It is not a computation problem. Yeah, it's a moral and ethical issue. Intelligence comes from intellegere, the ability to choose between right and wrong, truth and falsehood. That is not what artificial intelligence does. Artificial intelligence is machine learning that can replay small elements of human intelligence, the analytic side. But the synthesizing side is the only way you have it is by living it. It is not a computational problem. The second is, at this time when we are in an ecological catastrophe, a revisiting of our relationship with nature, a revisiting of the mechanical philosophy that has led to all of this has become necessary. And more work is now being done, indigenous cultures always said, we are part of one family, life is intelligent, plants are intelligent, rivers are live. Gaia is self-organized. Now, new sciences are teaching us that bacteria are intelligent, plants are intelligent, animals are intelligent, and Gaia as a whole is intelligent. So the talk of an artificial intelligence is missing out the part of intelligence that we really need to be looking at, and our own natural, ecological, emotional intelligence, our compassionate intelligence, the ability to care for each other and care for the earth, and cooperative intelligence, because the systems, epistemic systems of mechanical thought gave us the economic systems of competition and scarcity. But the world works on cooperation. Right. Nature works on cooperation. Human beings are alive because they're cooperating with each other. Of course, the market domain forces them to compete, but the market domain is not what makes us human. And therefore, we need to really look into our deep values. And this, under the surveillance under the skin, right, is misleading for two reasons. That it doesn't just get into the skin through evolutionary process. It gets into the skin through totalitarian processes. And the naturalizing of totalitarianism is the danger of using tools of control as if they were the next step of human evolution. Human evolution has many, many choices. This is one path, and it's a path being shaped by a handful of people. When the WTO, was institutionalized, Klaus Schwab had said, this will be the constitution of the world. There'll be no national constitutions. And he called me. He called me because, we shut down WTO in Seattle. And he still owes me an apology because the second time I went, just like there are 5,000 policemen right now guarding the World Economic Forum, there were thousands of policemen. And the protesters against World Economic Forum asked me to come out and address them. And of course, my real solidarity is with them. So I walked across the snows and the policeman tried to beat me up. And I went back and I had a press conference. And I said, Mr. Schwab has to apologize. He cannot treat us as guests inside and enemies outside. This is no decent way to behave. So, Klaus Schwab has been put there by same Kissinger who said food is a weapon. Right. He's been trained by Kissinger. They have been at the task of subverting national sovereignty and subverting democracy for very, very long time. And the fact that he wrote COVID-19 and the Great Reset shows that every attempt was made to use COVID to put in place the future they want. But they hadn't anticipated first that the tools would be so clumsy and would not deliver the way they had to. That second, not all of society, but at least some people would wake up. And therefore, the only way this process can happen is through violence and dictatorship. It cannot happen if human beings are free and make their choices. If human beings use their consciousness to say, this I do not accept. Gandhi had a beautiful word for it. Satyagraha. Satya, truth. Agraha, the force of truth, the power of truth. This is how he fought the British Empire in South Africa and in India. That at the end of the day, the power to say no to injustice and the creation of domination is in our hands. And that power to say no to this dystopian future of total control is in everyone's hands. And the power to say yes to creating a deeper democracy that I call Earth democracy, a democracy with all of life and in our everyday life. And a democracy where people don't have to freeze in winter and people don't have to die of hunger because the earth gives everything we need. And it's only the injustices that create the poverty, the homelessness, the hunger, and it's a moment where the totalitarians want total control. That's why I wrote oneness versus 1%. And yet here we are, the rest of us, who the totalitarians are saying are not needed. Yeah, they'll be replaced by artificial intelligence and robots. We don't need 99%. But the 99% has the solidarity of all the other beings on the earth herself, and our power as human beings, as conscious beings, to not be just thrown into this mincemeat of disposability and expendability.
Just on what you said, in your book, Oneness versus the 1%, you write that the choice is between freedom through oneness versus slavery to the 1%, between staying alive versus extinction. Would you please elaborate on maybe, for the audience, how the 1% use the money and technology machine to steal freedom and destroy our planet?
Well, I'm from India, and I grew up in independent India. The British had made life impossible for the Indians. We grew abundant food, but our people starved because the British were extracting all the rents. $45 trillion was taken from India. We used to be 35% of the world economy. And they reduced us to 1.5%.
Right.
By just taking what we produced and transferring it to England. This system is a slave system. Not only because what you grow, you don't have control over it, but more than that, things like commercial crops like indigo were grown under slave conditions. That is why the first revolution in India after the 1857 against the East India Company was on the indigo cultivation. It was the indigo revolt, where peasants weren't allowed to grow food for themselves on their land. They had to grow indigo for the British. And just like on American cotton plantations, they used to go around on a horse with whip, they were doing exactly the same in India. And the movement was there. Then Gándhí came, and when he returned from South Africa, this is the movement he supported. And the records are clear. They said that for every shipment of indigo, it was drenched in the blood of the Indian people.
Right.
But I want to just share with you two other quotes. When I wrote the Green Revolution book, I was following everything that was happening in Punjab. And there was one particular gathering where the declaration was made that when we do not choose what seeds we use, when we do not choose how we grow our crops, when we do not choose where our crops will go, when we do not choose the price at which they will sell, we are living under slavery.
Right.
And the same thing was then said when women of Plachimada, little village, out of the blue they called me and said, come and support us. They were fighting Coca-Cola, which was stealing their water. And I went and I realized what was happening. And then I asked the woman, what do you want me to tell the people when I return to Delhi? And my Lama, the leader of the movement, said, tell them when they drink Coca-Cola, they drink the blood of my people. This is a drink of slavery. So if you look at all of these elements, not saving seed is becoming a seed slave. Eating junk food because your local food systems have been destroyed. You're a food slave. And now with the surveillance capitalism and the rise of surveillance capitalism, we are all being turned into permanent slaves. And more, as the book sitting on my table, Surveillance Capitalism by Susanna Zuboff of Harvard University. She says, we are both the new raw material. Earlier raw material was bauxite, coal, oil. We and our data is the new raw material. But we are also the dump yard. Because just like a mine extracts the raw material but leaves pollution and leaves mine spoils everywhere. Gold mines leave spoils, copper mine leaves spoil, limestone mines leave spoil, and I've done so many studies on these issues. So on the one hand, you extract and then you dump waste. And the dumping of waste is the work of algorithms and artificial intelligence, of behavior modification, as she describes it. And what are the two behaviors that can be manipulated? Both are external behaviors, our relationship with the market, which is buy this, buy this, buy this, buy this. And the second is our relationship with democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Is democracy freedom that we live and experience, or is democracy giving a vote on the basis of the algorithms spreading hate propaganda? And that's why the atmosphere of hate that is pervading through the world, the cultural polarizations that are being fed by all of this, is part of this new surveillance stage. So that's why for me oneness is so important. Oneness is to realize, well, I could be Muslim or Hindu, it doesn't matter, I'm human.
Right.
I could be a man or a woman, it really doesn't matter. You're human. And I could be a human, and there could be a butterfly. It doesn't matter, because we are earth beings. And in the earth, we are a family. Or we can, most people will not be the 1%. They definitely will. And therefore, as the 99%, they can defend their freedoms at the deepest level. And that's why I build the movements on seed freedom, food freedom, earth democracy, as lived freedom every day. Or they can slip initially into the slave situation and then into the disposable.
It seems like the divide and conquer, rule and divide is like a very important agenda, because it seems you can control people much better, use them as natural resource, right? Because that's what Shoshana Zuboff in the book says. We became the raw material. So yeah, it's much easier for the elitists to control people when they are divided, right? When we can kind of create these artificial divisions. That's definitely true, and we see that throughout the history. Yeah.
There's a group called After School that does illustrations, and they've done an illustration of oneness versus 1% as divide and rule, bringing out exactly the message.
Interesting. I would like to ask you about what your opinions are about the sustainable movement, because when I started teaching at the university, almost 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the sustainable movement was still kind of alive, and it was a real promise, right? The Sustainable Development Goals and so on. But now, over the last few years, many, even in those who promoted sustainable movement in the 90s, are now huge critics, especially how it's being applied by the UN. They criticize the movement as a mask or pretext for further commodification of nature, stealing of resources, and further impoverishing the majority of people, especially in the developing countries. Do you agree with that? Are you also sort of being disappointed where it went, after those 30, 40 years?
My own work began locally with the Chipko movement. But I played a very big role in the treaties that came out of the Earth Summit, in the Convention on Biological Diversity.
It was in Rio?
Yes, very much. And I worked very hard to bring in many clauses in the Convention on Biological Diversity.
It was 1992, right? 1992 in Rio.
19.3 is the article where I told governments, that these new GMOs that they're wanting to bring will have impact on biodiversity, and there should be an assessment. So we created the framework of biosafety, and I'd been appointed as an expert by the United Nations. So, in the lead up to the Earth Summit and in the decade following that, movements were defining what sustainability is, that it is protecting the base of sustenance that nature provides, and through that, defending the rights of the people to their homes, their habitats, their diversity. The first place where the shift came was 10 years after Rio in Johannesburg, where suddenly the corporations had entered. It's not that the corporations were absent in the lead up to Rio, but we defeated the Monsantos because they were speaking rubbish. And the governments were still sovereign. So they would listen to their people. But 10 years later, the water corporations were there to privatize water. The agribusiness was there to sell GMOs. And I remember all of us who had been part of building up the Earth Summit process, we walked out. We left in a protest and we marched the streets. And again, that's another time the police beat us up. Since that time, what has last year been? Now, in 2021, the World Food Summit, which is governed by the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome, it's always in Rome, and it's always a UN summit. But the UN signed an agreement with the World Economic Forum, and Mr. Gates ran the Food Summit in New York with CropLife, which is the pesticide industry, and he has the Green Revolution in Africa. In spite of all the failures in India, he's pushing those failures in Africa. And the lady he appointed to head the Green Revolution in Africa was chairing this summit. So the food system was hijacked. During COVID, we watched the World Health Organization stop being a multilateral body. It became an arm of the pharmaceutical industry and Mr. Gates. Take climate change. Again, Big Oil is constantly taking over, but Mr. Gates is running the show. Why did I write Oneness versus 1%? Because in 2015 at Paris, I had been in so many summits. But in summits, the heads of state come as heads of state. It's the first time a billionaire was on the stage with heads of state. I said, since when did this happen? Since when did the structures of sovereignty get substituted by the structures of big money? And how is Bill Gates giving instructions of what the solutions are? More genetic engineering, more geoengineering. And this last year, he has absolutely gone ballistic. Eating fake food is a solution to climate change. Killing the cows is a solution to climate change. Torturing the fruit fly to produce proteins to then use to make lab meat and then grind up these dead flies for food. All of this twisting is Mr. Gates' agenda. Silicon Valley is financing fake food and lab food. They have made enough money by turning us into digital slaves and through their digital dictatorships of the sly kind or the overt kind. Now the data's coming out, how during COVID, they decided what messages would reach the public and what knowledge would reach the public. They were censoring true science. So the UN has been hijacked. It used to be one country, one vote. So the smallest island nation had power, as much power as the American. A tiny mountain state like Bhutan had power. Now it has become the dollar in the pockets of the billionaires drives it. But they aren't just driving it. They are turning the crises they have created into their next market opportunity. So if you look at the climate issue, every pseudo-climate greenwashing is a new market of carbon offsets, a new market of carbon trading, a new market of grabbing farmland and indigenous people's lands. And it's not an accident that Mr. Gates is the biggest farmland owner of America now. But if you take the Biodiversity Treaty, which in November they had the COP in Montreal, they too are financializing biodiversity. And Mr. Schwab and this group of elite put out a language where they say, nature positive. Well, if you know we are a little part of nature, our role is to not destroy nature. Nature creates her next step of evolution. Nature positive is still the anthropocentric arrogance. You know, I'm even better than nature. Second, these ideas of 30% by 2030 are in fact new ways of grabbing the remaining resources who, like artisanal fishermen have protected the seas. Small farmers have protected the land and biodiversity. Indigenous people have protected the forest. 80% biodiversity is in the 25% land where the indigenous people are. But the commercialization and financialization of biodiversity is fitting into the larger picture of financialization of nature. And I wrote a piece which should be available on the Navdanya International website last Mother Earth Day. Mother Earth is not for sale. Because again, Rockefeller comes back into the picture. Rockefeller and the New York Stock Exchange floated new natural asset companies. Right. So we will now redefine nature as a financial asset, which we will control, we will multiply fictitiously, and we can create $4,000 trillion of fictitious wealth under their hand. But that fictitious wealth, of course, will be used for more control. But worst, it will take away the river from the people of the riparian culture. They will take away the coasts from the fishing communities. They will take away the farms from the farming communities. So behind it is the ultimate resource grab. And that's why across our diversities, we must develop new solidarities and truthfulness. Back to Gandhi Satyagraha. The lie that finances in Wall Street can be used to protect the earth when they created the 2008 crisis. That's why we need to be able to distinguish between illusion and untruth on the one hand, and reality and truth on the other. And for people, when they say, well, what do we do? I said, eat real food. It's revolutionary. One would never have thought that eating and growing real food could be part of a revolution.
It's simple things, right? Simple things that change. But before we get to the end, and I want to ask you about these different Gandhian principles, you kind of mentioned the COVID pandemic, and it seems to me that in many ways it was just like the agenda on the steroids, the agenda of accumulation of power and resources, seemed like it was intensified so much in the last 2 years, almost like the pandemic was used, as a great opportunity. Now Jeffrey Sachs talks about the virus actually escaping from the lab, right? There are just kind of discussions if the virus was natural origin or not. There's more and more evidence that might have escaped from the lab. So thinking of how the big tech and big pharma has basically just transferred so much wealth, right? Even more than they did in the last several decades. Right? There seem to be more questions than answers, right? After these 2 years, and I don't know, it raises a lot of questions. what has happened over the last 2 years?
Well, in India, we know that India is a land of small farmers, small retailers, small businesses, and lockdown meant shops had to close.
Right.
The small vegetable vendor couldn't sell. But who was allowed to sell?
Yeah, the big shops.
Amazon. Amazon exploded during the lockdown. And
the Walmarts and these big stores, right?
Defeated in an earlier round in India. So it's really Amazon that took over. But you're so right. And, Mr. Klaus Schwab has written COVID-19, The Great Reset.
Right.
Now, you don't write a fat book as soon as a pandemic hits. That fat book, the text is already ready. And the language of the Great Reset itself, shows you how, it's like they're sitting on a machine and turning the knob, just like in the concentration camps, just turn the knob. And the idea of the Great Reset at a time of a health crisis is an inappropriate language.
Exactly. When you're talking about how the answers are simple. Just grow your own food, right? Have your own garden. And, there are critics who say, that small scale organic farming, though good in ideals, is not productive, and can never feed the world, right? They use that. What would you say to that, right? That it's unrealistic that all these people live in cities, 70% now. So how do we make that transformation?
Since 1984, I've applied all of my mind and all my scientific training to address this issue.
Right.
Does green revolution produce more? Mm-hmm. The category yield is designed to only measure a commodity. It doesn't measure the productivity of a farm. A farm is multidimensional, multifunctional. Therefore, a true productivity needs to take into account everything that grows on a farm. And because food is about nutrition, not about profits and trade, the yield might be fine if you're producing more commodities, but the nutrition is what matters when it comes to food. So I started very early. Instead of yield of monocultures, I started to look at the output of biodiversity. And the two things come out. First, that the more biodiverse intensive your small farms are, the more food and nutrition they actually produce. And let me just run through just some graphic images. So here's our study of health per acre. The tall bar is the bar of organic and biodiverse. The small bar. Can
you put it little higher? Little higher? Yeah, perfect.
So
thank you.
That's the protein content.
Uh-huh.
And these are averages of hundreds of farms. The energy content, the carotene content. Look at the bar, because carotene is important to the golden rice. You remember?
Right.
Yeah. Here's your solution. Thiamine content. Thiamine, riboflavin, folic acid, iron. Look at iron.
Yeah.
So it's so clear that if you want to feed the world, you produce more nutrition per acre, not more commodities. Further, the data is showing very clearly that as we apply chemicals to the soil, we destroy the soil's capacity to produce nutrients, which it can feed the plants with. So in effect, we are producing nutritionally empty commodities. And a British meta-study has shown that, covering more than 400 studies, that organic foods have up to 60% more beneficial nutrients than chemically produced food. And another synthesizing table showing the losses of essential nutrients in the industrial system. So whether it is the nutrition in the biodiversity or the nutrition in the organic methods of production, the only way to go is biodiverse regenerative agriculture. We are producing lots of commodities, but 90% of the corn and soya of the world is being used for biofuel and animal feed. It's not a food system. Second, where people are eating that nutritionally empty stuff, they're getting sick first because of the chemicals and toxics in the food. Second, because of the deficiencies in the food. When one of the scientists from Australia came and saw our data on how the Navdanya practices have increased the soil's ability to produce micronutrients and trace elements. The zinc had gone down in chemical farms. 200 farms studied in Doon Valley.
Right.
The zinc reduced by 37.8%, nearly 40% disappeared. And on the organic farms, it increased by 14%. Scientists have found lack of zinc, not only as responsible for worsening your immunity, but worse. In Australia, they found zinc deficiency was leading to depression. So the consequences, the health consequences, are huge. And we need to look at food as it was always looked at, as medicine, as nutrition, not as a commodity to be weighed and sent on a container.
Right.
So those who say the ecological systems can't feed the world, well, the only ones that are really feeding the world. The others are feeding the profits of the chemical industry, the poison cartel.
Right. Yeah, and I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but thanks to the Green Revolution, agriculture, and the industrial agriculture, we lost 30 to 40% of arable land, right, in the last 50, 60 years.
Yes, the desertification figures are there.
Exactly. So it's
I have a book called
alarming.
Who Really Feeds the World that I did for the Expo in Milan. They'd appointed me ambassador and they wanted me to write who really, because feeding the world was the theme of the Milan Expo.
Right.
They asked me to write who really feeds the world. And I have the desertification figures here. 90% biodiversity is gone, 75% soil and water degraded, 50% of the greenhouse gases come from this same system that is destroying biodiversity, destroying soil, destroying water, and destroying our health.
Is this the same book you used for the graphs? Is this the same book?
Edition, but the title is Who Really Feeds the World?
Okay. Oh, perfect. Thank you.
It's
just for the audience.
available in Italy from Feltrinelli, and it's available from North Atlantic, and I think the other publishers in different parts.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
it's available in German.
Do we have time for 2 last questions?
Yeah,
Is that okay?
Yes, yeah, we're running late, yeah.
Yeah. I have just we'll wrap it up. But I do have to ask you, you also describe yourself as a long-term feminist. And I do want to ask you about what you think of the woke culture, the different ways to formalize transgender, the new laws in some countries that now allows, 16 years old children to change their sex on the ID cards, how this whole issue of gender is being politicized. Do you think it's part of the divide and rule concept, or what is going on? It's
definitely a part.
It's confusing.
Confusing your identity, because as an ecologist, as a feminist,
right,
I know that my identity is a whole. It's multidimensional.
Right.
The first identity I have is as an earth being.
Right.
The second identity I have as a human being. Then I have other smaller identities. But this is ultimate mechanistic reductionism, where the human being is disappearing. And one aspect of life is the one that is seen as identity, but worse, identity is your being, I am a carpenter, you are Zek, I'm Indian. That's the identity. And when identities are to be engineered, then you're falling into the same trap as genetic engineering. Yeah, that someone with power is engineering you.
Right.
It's the opposite of autonomy.
Right. It's a very useful way to think about that. Let me go to my last question. At the end of your book, you describe some Gándhian principles, namely Swarai, which is self-rule, and Swadeshi, which means self-reliance, and Satyagraha, which means real resistance, right? Those are principles that you describe that if we lived by them, we could change the world in which we live. Do you think that these principles could also be practiced here in Europe or in the United States or, in some of the Western countries? Are they universal?
The principles are universal because they flow from a deep understanding of what is real freedom. And Swaraj, which means self-rule, also means self-organization. It means autopoiesis. Now, more and more beautiful research is coming out to say the tiniest microbe, the soil organisms, the fungi, plants, they are self-organized beings. So the human freedom and nature's freedom follow the same principles. So they're more than universal in terms of they're beyond the human being. They're about life on earth. Self-reliance, Swadeshi, means local. swa-desh, swa-self, desh, place, using resources that belong to the local, both to reduce ecological footprint, but also to reduce dependence. And the example is that when the British were finishing us off, pushing us to famine, Gandhi pulled out the spinning wheel and said, as long as we are dependent on selling our cotton and indigo to them and buying our textiles from them, our clothing from them, we will be slaves. So we will make our own cloth. And the big revolution in India of Swadeshi was making your own cloth. And that's why from that I took the inspiration. We will save our seeds. That is Swadeshi. We will grow our food. So local, I have lived through this period of the destruction of national systems and fragmentation of national systems as happened with Yugoslavia. It was part of the globalization process.
Right.
And globalization now has reached a stage where it isn't just the corporations who are ruling the world, but the billionaires and their clubs like the World Economic Forum. So an accountability has got even further removed from people's sight and people's watch. And the economy has further abandoned people. They created poverty in India. They created hunger in India. But now in Europe, in the heart of Europe, they're creating hunger and an energy poverty. And they call it the cost of living crisis. I call it a denial to live with dignity. And the only way even the Europeans will be able to go through this crisis is to realize that we have to take into our hands our ability to produce things, to produce our food, to produce our energy, rather than be victims of a system that is designed to push us to hunger, designed to push us into the despair of not being able to warm your homes. And then, of course, satyagraha. What is more powerful than truth? And what is more universal than truth? And the power of truth is the power that has always countered, not the power, but the brute force of untruth, of falsehoods, of illusions. And if today we are being governed by untruth, truth then becomes the universal force for us to have knowledge, for us to practice our values, and for us to join hands for a freedom for life on earth and our freedoms and future generations.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great way to finish our interview, our conversation. What powerful words. Well, Dr. Shiva, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
There is definitely much more I would like to ask, but
another time we'll do another.
We'll leave that. Yeah, hopefully for next time. So maybe at the end, would you like to say a few words about your plans for this year or the Navdanya movement? What you're preparing, what your plans are?
Our work started with seeds. We've created 150 community seed banks, and we want to expand this even more. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we started by training farmers on ecological agriculture and the value of biodiversity. But now I look at the farmers who've been trained, and I want to see over the next decade farmers becoming the teachers. Mm-hmm. Farmers teaching other farmers, so that it doesn't matter where the world goes. They can start expanding the movement. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing was during COVID, because of our work on seeds, because of our work on ecological agriculture, because of our work on local markets, because of our work on Gardens of Hope,
right,
people had no food crisis. Even though people waiting for supply chains, the farmers couldn't sell, the consumers couldn't buy. And there was no lack. There was abundance everywhere. So we want to spread that. And definitely, the shift from economies of death and destruction to economies of life, and a shift from dead democracies to living democracies, where people participate and people shape their lives, their futures, and future in partnership with the earth.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. We'll definitely put the link to the Navdanya website under the video.
Yes. And the courses, because over these years, we didn't design the course, but the kind of people turned up at our doorstep. So we offer courses, before Women's Day, I'll be doing a course on ecofeminism. We do a month-long course in September on return to earth. Mm-hmm. Living seed, living soil, living food, living economies. The practice and the theory. Mm-hmm. And on our beautiful biodiversity farm, where we grow more than 2,000 kinds of varieties of crops. Mm-hmm. The practice is actually working with the soil, working with the seed, working in the kitchen, working with the communities that have made themselves self-reliant.
Yeah. So who knows? Maybe you will get some checks in your courses in India.
Welcome them
maybe. Okay. Again, thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.